The title of this particular talk is a convergence of 4 biblical signs. Everything that you're going to see, I've got biblical backing. Move on to the 3rd sign. Now, is there biblical evidence that may point to a possible economic upheaval within the span of time between 2014 and 15? Do we have historical evidence to support this possibility? Yes, we do. The 3rd sign is the Shemitah. Beginning on the evening of September 24th, 2014, we entered a new Jewish year. We moved from 5774 to 5775, and 5775 is a Shemitah year. What in the world is a Shemitah? The answer is found in 3 Bible passages, Exodus 23, Leviticus 25, and Deuteronomy 15. In Exodus 23, 10 and 11, we read, "For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops, but during the 7th year let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what they leave. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove." Leviticus 25, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather your crops. But on the 7th year the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest." And then in Deuteronomy 15 we find, "At the end of every 7 years you must cancel debts. This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel the loan he has made to his fellow Israelite. He shall not require payment from his fellow Israelite or brother, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your brother owes you. If a fellow Hebrew, a man or a woman, sells himself to you and serves you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let him go free, but not empty-handed." Now, these passages we learn that the Shemitah was a year of letting go. It was a year of release, a rest, a remission, a dissolution, a cancellation, or a nullification of debt. The Shemitah was year-long. It began on the first day of the 7th year of a 7-year cycle. It affected everyone, and it culminated on the very last day of the same 7th year. That day was Elul 29. Elul 29 comes around every year. It's one of those months of the Hebrew calendar. So Elul 29 comes around every year, but in a Shemitah year, on Elul 29, every creditor was to cancel the debts owed them by their fellow Israelites. In a sense, it was economic equalization. It was wonderful for debtors and the poor, but not so wonderful for creditors, especially those who didn't want to lose the profit they would have gained if the Shemitah year were a normal business year. Now, to keep the Shemitah would bring blessings from God. To not keep it would bring his curse or his judgment. This, of course, naturally begs the question, did God's people faithfully observe the Shemitah? No. Well then, what was the consequence of their unfaithfulness to keep the Shemitah? Exile to Babylon for 70 years. Why 70 years? 1 year for every Shemitah God's people, Judah, had not observed. Now this is what we read in 2 Chronicles 36:21. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested, until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So God simply handed his people over to Nebuchadnezzar. And when he took them off into Babylon, the land got its rest. Well, that works out to 490 years that Judah did not observe the Shemitah. Well, that's a lot of disobedience. It's also a lot of patience on God's part. Now, we need to understand this. The lack of observing the Shemitah wasn't the first thing to go in Israel. The first thing to go was their faithfulness to God. Little by little, Israel turned their back on God. They went after other gods. Now, failure to keep the Shemitah was a huge sign to God that profit was more important to his people than he was. So what was to have been a blessing to God's people, if observed by them, becomes a curse or a judgment when it is not observed. Okay, what does this Shemitah stuff have to do with us in America? After all, we're not Israel and we're not Jewish. Well, that's true. The requirement to keep the Shemitah was given to Israel and no one else. However, there's always a however in this stuff, isn't it? It's like, now the mandate for Israel and the judgment they receive for not observing it becomes a prophetic sign to the nations of the world when they turn their backs on God and go after other gods. What's a prophetic sign? A prophetic sign is evidence that God is operating in a similar way now as he has in the past by repeating a pattern. Let me read that again. It is evidence, the prophetic sign is evidence that God is operating in a similar way now as he has in the past by repeating a pattern. So according to ancient tradition, lunar eclipses were said to be a harbinger or omen to Israel, but solar eclipses were said to be a harbinger or omen to the nations. So now let's look again at the solar eclipses. Let's look forward before we look backward. So let's look again at the solar eclipses. Here we go. Passover. Now, I changed the slide a little bit. Now 2014 and 15 are in different configurations, so I could get the eclipses of the sun and the moon together all on 2015. So now you have this total solar eclipse, March 20th, and then you've got the total lunar eclipse on April 4th. Then you have the partial solar eclipse on September 13th, and then Feast of Tabernacles on September 28th of this year. Okay, we've already seen that the total solar eclipse takes place on the first day of the sacred calendar, and the partial takes place on the last day of the civil calendar. Well, guess what? It's Elul 29, the end of a Shemitah year. You have a convergence going on here, big time. Again, for God's people, the Shemitah meant giving the land rest for a year and forgiving debt. And all debt had to be nullified by Elul 29, the last day of the Shemitah year, by sundown. Had to be done. Okay, well, this is pretty interesting. How does it affect you and me here in America? Well, let's see if previous Shemitahs and previous Elul 29s have affected the nations, particularly America. The previous Shemitah would take us from 2015 this year, would take us back to 2008. The date of Elul 29 on the Gregorian calendar would have been September 29th, 2008. What happened on that date? Well, the day got off to an ominous start. The opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange and the opening bell at NASDAQ, they both failed to ring. It was seen as a bad omen. By the end of the day, at the closing bell on September 29th, 2008, on Wall Street, the Dow Jones fell 777 points, or it dropped 7%. 7% of the stock market debt had been nullified. Notice the sevens. Seven is God's perfect number. From the 7 days of creation to the 7 seals in the book of Revelation, the scriptures are saturated with sevens. 7 is God's number. His fingerprints were all over that day, and it was Elul 29. It was the day of a partial solar eclipse. Now, what if we go back to the previous Elul 29? What date will we be at then? Well, we'd be at September 17th, 2001. That day, by the end of the day, the Dow Jones had lost 7% of its value. Again, a 7. In fact, if we study the 5 greatest U.S. stock market crashes after World War II, we find that every single one of them occurred on Elul 29 or in the wake or aftermath of a Shemitah. That's pretty amazing. Now maybe you're wondering, well, why would God bring financial judgment on America? Well, because we, like Israel before us, have turned our collective backs on God. Now here's an historical fact, that the people who first came to America consecrated this new nation to God, and specifically that it be for the advancement of the Christian faith. Now here are the words of the Mayflower Compact. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but these are the first words. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. Mayflower Compact, 1620. Now on April 23rd, 1789, this is 1 week before the inauguration of George Washington. This happened in the New York Daily Advertiser, the paper of the day, 1 week before. This is what the paper had. On the morning of the day on which our illustrious president will be invested with his office, the bells will ring at 9 o'clock when the people may go up to the house of God and in a solemn manner commit the new government with its important train of consequences to the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. An early hour is prudently fixed for this particular act of devotion and is designated holy for prayer. Now here's part of Washington's inaugural address. Strongly religious. And he called his listeners to remember and acknowledge God. He said, in tendering this homage, this act of worship to the great author of every public and private good, I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments not less than my own, nor those of my fellow citizens at large, less than either. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. And we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious, favorable smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. As we've noted, the historical evidence is that America was consecrated to God at its inception, and we've been turning our backs now on him for about the last 50 years. What then would God be attempting to communicate to us through these judgments? Well, through them, he's calling us to return to him. God's judgments are never meant to destroy. They're meant to get our attention and to return us to him. Now, he doesn't want to destroy us, but our actions may not give him any choice. Just like Israel's actions after 490 years, he eventually had to act because he had told them exactly what he would do, and if he did not do exactly what he said he was going to do, then that makes him a liar, and God is no liar. So in this regard, if we want to avoid judgment and destruction, then we've got to implement God's remedy. Now the remedy is found in what the Lord told Solomon after the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem. The answer is found in 2 Chronicles 7, verse 13 and following. God said, notice this is God causing the problems. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Now we know that a third Shemitah is coming. This year it'll be September 13th, 2015. That is Elul 29. We do not know if there will be another financial collapse, or if there will be war between nations, or if there will be no judgments at all. I mean, God is not obligated to do any of the following. Okay? But the prophetic sign has already been given to us twice. The prophetic sign has already been given to us twice. It would be good for us to take notice of the signs God has given us. And if there is another financial collapse coming, how do we prepare for it or respond to it? So the third sign, the convergence that's happening, is the Shemitah. Apparently it does affect nations outside of Israel.